spend a lot of time doing in my work as a chaplain, and perhaps some of the students who are in fact here today through the summer will appreciate this, is telling people that they can eat, telling people that they can drink water, that it's okay to sleep. They don't have to prove their permission to take care of their basic human needs and sustenance by their productivity. You don't have to do a certain amount of homework in order to be allowed to take a nap or eat a meal or drink water. And I'm glad to see the professors here nodding and giving a thumbs up to this as well. But I do think we live in a world where it is just increasingly difficult to rest, to nourish ourselves, to Sabbath. And this sounds like I'm headed into a sermon about the importance of keeping Sabbath and the importance of observing the Sabbath, which we will get to. But I actually think there is something deeper in today's readings and today's gospel than just Sabbath. And it is what Jesus is saying about our humanity, our human worth and dignity, and what that means for ourselves and what that means about how we are called to embrace and interact with one another. So let's talk about today's gospel a bit, where we have these two different instances of Jesus and his disciples breaking the Sabbath, allegedly. Right? So we have Jesus and his disciples walking through this field where Jesus' disciples are plucking heads of grain. And I don't know enough about agriculture to know exactly about how they are eating them or what's going on there, but let's just assume for the sake of argument they are plucking some sort of food to eat on the Sabbath as they are walking through this field. And the second instance being this encounter with this man with a withered hand that Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And in both cases, Jesus encounters opposition from the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, for this breaking the law of the Sabbath. In one case, his disciples picking this food to eat, and in the other case, Jesus healing this man with the withered hand. And in this second account, we see this confrontation of Jesus and the Pharisees over Jesus' healing of this man on the Sabbath as one of the instances that leads these religious authorities to set about their clear opposition to him. Remember that this is still early in Mark's gospel. This is early in Jesus' ministry. And this confrontation about the observance of the Sabbath and Jesus healing this man becomes one of the inciting events for Jesus' opposition to the religious authorities of his day. And I want to say something a little bit controversial, which is that this week there is a part of me that is kind of on Team Pharisees here, right? They are correct in the observance of the Sabbath. And what we see when we look back at our first reading this week, we should be reminded that observance of the Sabbath is not just something we are permitted to do, not just a permission given in the Torah, but in fact a commandment. If you know your basic Sunday school memory, observance of the Sabbath is one of the top 10, we might say. God takes it somewhat seriously. And I think given the world we live in at this time, it is important for us to actually hear that commandment around the Sabbath. That God commanded God's people from the initial giving of the law to observe and protect Sabbath rest. And I'm pretty sure it is easy for all of us here to think pretty quickly at how hard it is actually to observe and protect Sabbath in the world we live in, right? The technology that we have that presumably was meant to make our work more efficient actually just means it's a lot harder to put parameters and boundaries on our work. Technology, electronic communication means it's much easier to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The space between life and work is a lot muddier than it was several decades ago, right? I think it is no secret to many of the families that are here, I know, that sports like to intrude on the ability to come together on a Sunday and worship, right? We live in a world where those boundaries of work and rest are a lot fuzzier. Blown up, yes, blown up altogether, and I am sure our students understand that sense of always feeling like you have to work and be productive. There is always more studying that can be done. There's always more reading to do. There's always another Passover you can do on a paper to edit it. And resting, setting aside, protecting time for Sabbath is actually pretty revolutionary in today's world. I dare say it's pretty radical. And I think we need to hear and understand why the Pharisees push against Jesus and his disciples, seeming to transgress against that commandment of Sabbath that was given to God's people. But maybe if there is something that the Pharisees, these religious leaders, are missing, it is in that point that Jesus makes of the Sabbath being given to humankind for the sake of humankind. We are not made for the Sabbath. And maybe if there is something being missed by these religious leaders, it is the purpose for which Sabbath is given. Sabbath is not given as a rule to be observed for its own sake, a law to be observed for its sake, something to be given to be a burden. But Sabbath is in fact a commandment given to us as a gift, because God desires our flourishing. God desires us to live abundantly. And there is something about the nature of Sabbath, observing and holding and keeping Sabbath, that I think confronts so much of the false senses of urgency in our world, right? And if we look at the instances for which the Sabbath is broken, both of these stories, they're actually not that critical, right? Like, so the disciples are walking along and pluck some grain for their food. We don't have an instance that the disciples are in a dire situation of hunger, right? This is not the disciples trying to, put off starvation. It seems like maybe this is just an afternoon snack, let's assume, right? In the case of this man with the withered hand, this also is not exactly a life or death crisis of healing. This is presumably something that could have waited till sundown for Jesus to heal. This is not something that needed to be solved right in the moment. And yet Jesus does confront the Pharisees by choosing to heal this man of his withered hand in this moment. And I think there is something to that. That God desires us to be nourished. God desires us to be whole. It doesn't have to be a life or death crisis for us to be permitted to nourish ourselves, to seek and embrace and accept God's healing. And I wonder if what Jesus is confronting in the Pharisees here is in fact that false sense of urgency of their own righteousness, right? That the keeping of the Sabbath is not an end to itself. Righteousness, the fulfilling of the law, is not a greater end and a greater purpose unto itself than feeding our bodies and offering healing and wholeness to someone standing before you. And I think that says a lot about confronting the false senses of urgency in the world around us that pose a great risk, indeed, to the abundance that God desires us to live into as people made in the dignity and image of God, and the freedom that we are called into to extend such grace and love to the people around us. One of the things that I realized when I was a student, and those of you who knew me as a student might appreciate this. I am looking at you, Robert. I was a little obsessive, a little intense, not gonna lie. It's a time. And it made me so much smaller as a person. It made me such a less generous friend. It made me a less generous partner. Ask what he means. And I think it is important for us to remember that is not what God desires for us in our lives or in our relationships with one another. God does not desire us to be productive or perfect or perfectly righteous at the expense of the abundance of life God calls us into in ourselves and in our relationships with one another. And there are things that are urgent in our world. I'm not going to lie and pretend that that is not the case. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of the world that we want to live in and the world that we want to build, and how we work as the body of Christ to bring this world into the image of God's desire for love and justice and a reflection of the values of God's kingdom. And yet, we cannot live into that image if we are starving ourselves of the abundance God desires for us, if we are starving ourselves of the love and compassion we are called to show to those living next to us in our lives. And to remember that the purpose for which we are called is to live into the fullness and abundance of God's love and to reflect that love to one another. And there is nothing more urgent than that.